Hey podcast people, I wanted to tell you about one of my all-time favorite podcasts called The Self-Made Man with Mike Dillard. I just heard this really interesting episode called An Honest Talk About Marriage, Divorce, and Pre-Nups with Alyssa Rower. Now, Alyssa is a divorce attorney, and she has a very interesting, candid talk about her profession and gives some advice for how to navigate around prenuptial agreements, how to talk about finances with your spouse or your spouse-to-be, and also how to approach divorce. She says, you wouldn't start a company without an ownership and operating agreement, especially if on day one you have to put 100% of your assets into that company. Now, of course, this is not the sexiest conversation to have with your significant other, but that's exactly why I found this episode so important for us to be able to listen to and discuss. Now, if you're not familiar with the Self-Made Man podcast, this is a little bit of a divergence of what he usually has on the show, in which he's talking with successful entrepreneurs who have made it into their field, and marketing experts, and online e-commerce gurus, people who have built apps and web services, and all that kind of stuff. So this was a little bit different, but Mike personally was married, and 18 months later, he got divorced. He lost half of all of his assets, like you do, and it's very interesting to start thinking about alimony payments and how a prenuptial agreement might be structured before you tie the knot. I think it's important to keep in mind when you're listening to this podcast that Rower is somewhat biased. So she points out the interesting fact that if you want to have a prenuptial agreement done right, of course the cost is going to vary from state to state and depending on what kind of attorney you want to go with, but she recommends that each partner should have their own attorney and that structuring a prenuptial agreement could cost about $10,000 on average, meaning it might cost a little more, it might cost a little less, but just like everything else in life, you get what you pay for. The reason it's important to understand who this advice is coming from is it's kind of like going to the barber, right? If you ask a barber, you think I need a haircut? They're probably going to tell you yes. As part of her profession, of course, she's going to recommend prenuptial agreements, but I think it's really interesting to get advice from someone who is married herself, happily married, and has seen so many different divorces throughout her career. Some divorces that were very amicable and went down really smooth, and they're still great friends and co-parents and things like that. And divorces that have been really nasty and that have had really extreme financial setbacks. Whether or not you are personally interested in pursuing a prenuptial agreement or thinking about what that structure might look like, I'm going to recommend that you check out this podcast really no matter where you're at in your relationship, but especially if you're a single man, because it's important to understand how to have these conversations with your significant other. These things are really important. They do have really significant lasting effects on our lives. Getting married could be one of the best decisions you make in your entire life, or it could also be one of your worst. So again, you want to learn how to mitigate those risks and how to think about these things maturely from an objective perspective. So hey you guys, I'm probably going to end up reviewing another Self-Made Man podcast because like I said, this is a little bit of a departure from what he usually talks about on the show. So if you have a Self-Made Man podcast that you love or you'd love to see me review, hey, drop a comment below and I would love to have a listen. All right, podcast people, keep your earbuds in and I'll check you on the next episode.